Wings that feed the world. A history of bees. Ancient origins. 130 million years ago, the world looked nothing like it does today. The continents had not yet drifted to their familiar positions. Dinosaurs held unchallenged dominion over the land. And amid the dense fern thickets of the Cretaceous period, something quiet and almost invisible was taking place. Something that would prove to be one of the most consequential transformations in the history of life on Earth. On the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana, the first flowering plants were beginning to appear. Modest, unassuming things, nothing like the lush gardens we take for granted. But it was these humble pioneers that set in motion a chain of events whose consequences are still unfolding today. Among the insects of that era, there lived a lineage of predatory wasps. Small, aggressive creatures that hunted other arthropods for food. They were carnivores, built for the chase and the kill. But some of these wasps began to notice something new in their environment. The primitive flowers that were spreading across the landscape offered pollen, a food source rich in protein that required no struggle, no pursuit, no risk. All a wasp had to do was land and eat. It is difficult to overstate how radical this dietary shift would prove to be. Over millions of years, natural selection went to work on these pollen-feeding wasps, reshaping them generation by generation into something entirely new. Their bodies grew rounder, better suited for carrying loads of pollen from flower to flower. Fine, branched hairs evolved across their exoskeletons, a kind of biological Velcro, exquisitely designed to trap microscopic grains. Their mouthparts lengthened, allowing them to reach deeper into flowers for nectar. Slowly, imperceptibly, across geological ages, predators became pollinators. Wasps became bees. The oldest known fossil evidence of this transformation is a specimen called Melidosphex burmensis, discovered preserved in amber from Myanmar. It dates to approximately 100 million years ago, placing it squarely in the age of the dinosaurs. This tiny creature, barely 3 millimeters long, displays a striking blend of features: the body plan of a wasp, alongside the branched hairs that define modern bees. It is a snapshot of evolution caught in mid-stride, a creature frozen in amber at the very moment its lineage was crossing the threshold from one way of life to another. But the story of how bees came to be cannot be told in isolation, because it was never a solo performance. It was a duet. As bees evolved to harvest pollen and nectar, flowering plants, the angiosperms, evolved in tandem to attract them. Petals grew brighter, fragrances grew sweeter, shapes grew more elaborate, more specialized, more seductive. Each kingdom drove the other toward greater complexity, greater diversity, greater interdependence. Biologists call this co-evolution, and the partnership between bees and flowers is one of its most spectacular examples. This mutual transformation triggered what scientists refer to as the Cretaceous terrestrial revolution, a period of explosive diversification in which flowering plants spread across the globe and bees radiated alongside them, filling niche after ecological niche. By the time a massive asteroid slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago, bringing the age of the dinosaurs to a catastrophic end, bees had already established themselves as one of the most important animal groups on the planet. The dinosaurs perished. The bees endured. And in the aftermath of that extinction, as flowering plants surged to dominance across every continent, bees diversified into the roughly 20,000 species known to science today. The range is staggering. From Perdita minima, a solitary bee barely 2 millimeters long that nests in the desert sands of the American Southwest, to Wallace's giant bee, Megachile pluto, a colossus with a wingspan of 6 centimeters that was thought extinct for decades before being rediscovered in the forests of Indonesia in 2019. Most of these 20,000 species are solitary creatures. They do not live in hives. They do not make honey. They dig burrows in the ground, nest in hollow stems, or carve tunnels in dead wood. They live alone, raise their young alone, and die alone. The vast majority of the world's bees are quiet, unobtrusive, and utterly unknown to most people. And then there are the bumblebees, the genus Bombus, a group of roughly 250 species that occupy a fascinating middle ground between solitary life and the elaborate societies of the honeybee. Bumblebees are social, but their colonies are small and temporary, numbering in the dozens or low hundreds rather than the tens of thousands. They are built for cold. Their large, densely furred bodies can generate heat through a process called thermogenesis, vibrating their flight muscles without moving their wings, which allows them to fly in temperatures that would ground a honeybee. This makes them indispensable pollinators in northern latitudes, at high altitudes, and in the cool hours of early morning when other bees are still dormant. They also possess a trick that honeybees cannot perform: buzz pollination. By clamping onto a flower and vibrating at a specific frequency, a bumblebee can shake loose pollen that is otherwise locked inside the anthers, a technique essential for pollinating tomatoes, blueberries, cranberries, and dozens of other crops. Without bumblebees, your breakfast would look very different. But among all these thousands of species, one genus would come to matter more than any other to the story of human civilization. Its name is Apis, the honeybee. And the relationship between this small insect and our own species would prove to be one of the most intimate, most enduring, and most consequential partnerships in the entire history of life. Bees and the first civilizations. The honeybee and the human. Two species whose fates would become so deeply intertwined that it is difficult to imagine the history of one without the other. The earliest evidence of humans seeking out honey reaches back at least 8,000 years. In a shallow cave near Valencia, Spain, a place known as the Cuevas de la Araña, the Spider Caves, there is a rock painting that has survived since the Mesolithic period. It depicts a human figure clinging to a cliff face, one arm thrust into a crevice in the rock, surrounded by a cloud of small painted dots. Bees. The figure is harvesting honey from a wild colony, and the unknown artist who painted this scene captured something timeless: the ancient, dangerous, irresistible human hunger for sweetness. For thousands of years, this was the only way to obtain honey. You found a wild colony, climbed to wherever it had built its nest, usually somewhere high, inaccessible, and extremely well defended, and you took what you could before the stinging became unbearable. It was robbery, pure and simple. There was no partnership in it, no cultivation, no understanding of the creatures whose stores you were plundering. In parts of Africa, this ancient practice gave rise to one of the most extraordinary interspecies collaborations on Earth, one that persists to this day. In the woodlands of Mozambique, Tanzania, and Kenya, the greater honey guide, a small, drab bird with an outsized reputation, leads human honey hunters to wild bee colonies. The bird calls, flutters conspicuously from tree to tree, and waits for the human to follow. When the nest is found, the human opens it with smoke and tools, takes the honey, and leaves behind the wax and larvae, which the honey guide cannot access on its own, but relishes as food. The Yao people of Mozambique even use a specific call, a loud trill, to summon the birds, and research published in 2016 confirmed that honey guides respond to this call far more readily than to other sounds. It is a partnership that likely stretches back tens of thousands of years, predating agriculture, predating civilization itself. But it was in the great river civilizations of the ancient world that the relationship between humans and bees shifted from opportunistic raiding to something more deliberate. In Egypt, the bee was not merely useful, it was sacred. The hieroglyph of the bee represented Lower Egypt, and for more than 3,000 years, every pharaoh bore the title He of the Sedge and the Bee, sovereign of both Upper and Lower Egypt. The bee was a symbol of royal authority, stamped onto seals, carved into temple walls, woven into the very language of power. The Egyptians were among the first true beekeepers in history. Temple reliefs at the Sun Temple of Nusret-Ini at Abu Ghurab, dating to around 2,400 years before the Common Era, depict detailed scenes of organized apiculture. Cylindrical clay hives stacked horizontally in rows, beekeepers using smoke to pacify the colonies, honey being poured into storage jars. These are not images of wild honey hunting. They are images of an industry. And the Egyptians practiced a form of migratory beekeeping that would not seem unfamiliar to a modern commercial apiarist. They floated their hives on rafts along the Nile, following the bloom northward as spring advanced up the river valley, ensuring their bees always had access to fresh forage. Honey was far more than food in Egypt. It was medicine, preservative, and sacred offering all at once. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest known medical texts, dating to roughly 1,600 years before the Common Era, prescribes honey for the treatment of wounds, a practice that modern science has vindicated since honey possesses genuine antibacterial properties due to its low moisture content, acidity, and the presence of hydrogen peroxide produced by an enzyme that bees add during the ripening process. Egyptian embalmers used honey and beeswax in the mummification of the dead, and sealed jars of honey have been recovered from Egyptian tombs more than 3,000 years old, still perfectly edible. Honey, as it turns out, is one of the only foods on Earth that essentially never spoils. The ancient Greeks inherited this reverence and enriched it with their own myths and observations. In Greek mythology, the infant Zeus himself was said to have been nurtured on honey, hidden in a cave on the island of Crete and fed by the nymph Melissa, whose name literally means bee in Greek. Honey was the food of the gods, the substance that conferred immortality, the sweetness at the heart of the divine. But the Greeks also brought something new to the human relationship with bees, the impulse to observe, to question, to understand. In the 4th century before the Common Era, Aristotle devoted extensive passages of his Historia Animalium to the behavior of bees, noting their division of labor, their production of wax, and what he perceived as their intelligence. He described the different castes within the hive with impressive accuracy for someone working without magnification or any way to open a colony without destroying it. He also got some things spectacularly wrong. Most notably, he believed the ruler of the hive was a king, not a queen. This error would persist, unchallenged, for 2,000 years. The Greeks gave the Western world mead, one of the oldest alcoholic beverages ever produced, made by fermenting honey with water. Temples maintained beehives on their grounds, and honey was used in religious rituals, in cooking, and as the primary sweetener in a world that had never known refined sugar. The very word honeymoon traces its origins to the ancient tradition of newlyweds drinking mead for a full lunar cycle after their wedding. Rome, as it so often did, took what the Greeks had poeticized and turned it into something practical and systematic. The great poet Virgil devoted the entire fourth book of his Georgics, published around 29 years before the Common Era, to the art of beekeeping. It is a work of considerable beauty, treating the hive as an ideal republic, and the bees as model citizens devoted to the common good. Roman agricultural writers like Columella, Varro, and Pliny the Elder all contributed detailed, practical instructions on hive management, honey extraction, and the medicinal uses of bee products. Pliny alone cataloged dozens of applications for honey and beeswax, from treating wounds to waterproofing the hulls of ships. And this pattern repeated itself across the ancient world, independently and simultaneously. The Maya of Central America revered a stingless bee species called Melipona beechii, and the bee god Muzen-Kab appears in the Madrid Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian Maya manuscripts. Melipona culture, the keeping of stingless bees, was a sophisticated practice among the Maya, with dedicated apiaries, harvest rituals tied to the calendar, and a honey that was used not only as food, but as a ceremonial offering and a medicine. The tradition survives among Maya communities in the Yucatan to this day, though it is declining as European honeybees displace the native stingless species. In the Hindu Vedas, composed thousands of years ago on the Indian subcontinent, honey is described as the food of the gods. The Rig Veda speaks of honey winds, honey dawns, honey rivers. Madhu, the Sanskrit word for honey, permeates the sacred texts like sweetness itself. In China, beekeeping has a history stretching back at least 3,000 years. The Chinese were among the first to keep Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee, a species smaller and less productive than its western cousin, but superbly adapted to the monsoon climates of East and Southeast Asia. Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty onward describe honey as a medicine of the highest order, and by the Tang Dynasty, beekeeping had become a well-documented agricultural practice, with detailed accounts of hive management, honey harvesting, and the use of bee products in traditional medicine. China would go on to become the largest producer of honey on Earth, a position it holds to this day, though not without controversy, as we shall see. In sub-Saharan Africa, in the islands of Southeast Asia, in every place where bees and humans coexisted, some version of this same story played out. Humans discovered honey, were drawn to it irresistibly, and gradually developed ways to secure a more reliable supply. Bees had become woven into the fabric of human culture, into religion, medicine, agriculture, mythology, and daily life. But for all this closeness, for all these millennia of coexistence, the inner workings of the hive remained wrapped in profound mystery. Nobody truly understood what happened in the darkness behind those walls of wax. Medieval honey and holy candles. In medieval Europe, honey and beeswax were not luxuries reserved for the wealthy. They were essential commodities woven into the daily life of an entire continent. The reason is simple. Before cane sugar arrived in Europe, which did not happen in any meaningful quantity until the era of the Crusades, and did not become affordable to ordinary people until the colonial plantations of the 17th and 18th centuries, honey was the only concentrated sweetener available. It went into food, into drinks, into medicines. Mead and metheglin, the spiced honey wines that had been brewed since antiquity, warmed the long, dark winters of northern Europe and featured at feasts and celebrations from Scandinavia to the British Isles. But as important as honey was, beeswax may have been even more valuable, and the reason for that lay not in kitchens or taverns, but in churches. The medieval Catholic Church had an enormous and insatiable appetite for candles. Church doctrine held that altar candles must be made of beeswax, not tallow rendered from animal fat, not any other substance. Only the product of the bee, an insect long associated with purity and virginity, was considered worthy to illuminate the house of God. The demand was staggering. A single large cathedral could burn through hundreds of pounds of beeswax in the course of a year, and there were thousands of churches, abbeys, and chapels across Christendom, all of them consuming wax at a prodigious rate. This created a thriving economy built entirely around bees. In medieval Russia and across Eastern Europe, a practice called bortnichestvo flourished, a form of forest beekeeping in which beekeepers maintained colonies in hollowed-out trees scattered through the woodlands. The word comes from bort, meaning a tree cavity used as a hive. These bee trees were marked, mapped, jealously guarded, and passed down through families like any other valuable inheritance. Russia's vast forests were, in a sense, one enormous apiary, and the wax and honey that flowed from them were major export commodities. Novgorod, that great medieval trading republic, grew wealthy in part on the trade in beeswax destined for the churches and monasteries of Western Europe. In England, the Domesday Book of 1086, the great survey of the realm commissioned by William the Conqueror, lists honey renders as significant economic assets, worth recording alongside land, livestock, and mills. Monasteries became the great centers of beekeeping knowledge during this period. Monks maintained extensive apiaries, not only for the practical value of the honey and wax they produced, but because the hive itself was seen as a model of Christian virtue, industrious, selfless, orderly, obedient to a single sovereign. The bee appeared in countless sermons, theological treatises, and illuminated manuscripts as a symbol of piety, diligence, and the well-ordered community. There was something deeply appealing to the medieval mind about a society in which every member knew its role and performed it without complaint for the good of the whole. The legal protections afforded to bees during this era reveal just how seriously people took them. In many Germanic and Slavic law codes, stealing a swarm of bees carried penalties as harsh as those for stealing cattle or horses. The Brehon laws of medieval Ireland, one of the most detailed legal systems of the early medieval world, prescribed specific fines for bee theft and even laid down rules about who owned a swarm that crossed a property boundary. If your bees settled on your neighbor's land, the law had an opinion about it. And yet, for all this close familiarity, medieval beekeepers understood remarkably little about the biology of the creatures they tended. The prevailing wisdom, inherited directly from Aristotle, passed through Virgil and Pliny, and repeated without serious challenge for century after century, held that the colony was ruled by a king. The origin of new bees was a matter of fantastic speculation. One popular belief, promoted by Virgil himself in the Georgics, held that bees could be generated spontaneously from the rotting carcass of an ox, a process known as bougonia. Educated men wrote about this with complete seriousness. The idea that the ruler of the hive might be female, that she might mate with drones in midair, that workers might be sterile females, all of this would have struck a medieval scholar as absurd. The truth would require a revolution, not just in beekeeping, but in the very way humans looked at the natural world. The Age of Discovery. The 17th century shattered certainties that had stood unchallenged since antiquity. In 1609, an English clergyman named Charles Butler published a book with a title that must have raised eyebrows across the learned world: The Feminine Monarchy. Butler had spent years observing his own hives with a patience and attentiveness that most of his contemporaries never bothered to apply to so humble a subject. And he had reached a conclusion that flatly contradicted 2,000 years of received wisdom, passed down from Aristotle through Virgil to every beekeeper in Christendom. The ruler of the hive, Butler declared, was not a king, it was a queen. Butler could not prove this with anatomical certainty. The tools did not yet exist. But his observations were sharp, and his instinct was correct. The definitive proof came in 1670, when the Dutch microscopist Jan Swammerdam placed a queen bee under magnification and dissected her with exquisite care. What he found settled the matter beyond all dispute. The sovereign of the hive possessed ovaries. She was unmistakably female. Swammerdam's meticulous anatomical drawings, published long after his death in his masterwork Biblia Natura in 1737, remain astonishing in their precision and beauty. He also demonstrated that the worker bees were likewise female, sterile females, and that the drones were male. In a single stroke of the dissecting needle, centuries of confusion were swept away. But perhaps the most extraordinary figure in the scientific investigation of bees was a man who could not see them at all. Francois Huber was born in 1750 in Geneva, Switzerland. As a young man, he lost his eyesight, a catastrophe that might have ended any hope of a career in natural observation. Huber refused to accept this. With the devoted help of his servant, Francois Bernens, who became his eyes and hands, and his wife, Marie-Aimée Lulin, who supported and encouraged his work, Huber designed an ingenious device that he called the leaf hive. It was built like a book. Wooden frames, each holding a sheet of comb, were hinged together so that the hive could be opened page by page. For the first time, a researcher could examine the interior of a living colony without tearing it apart. Through Bernens's eyes and his own relentless questioning, Huber made discovery after discovery. He established that queen bees mate not inside the hive, as had been assumed, but in the open air during flight, a perilous nuptial journey in which the queen mates with multiple drones at considerable altitude, storing enough sperm to fertilize eggs for the rest of her life. He demonstrated that bees regulate the temperature inside their colony with astonishing precision, maintaining roughly 35 degrees Celsius in the brood area, regardless of the weather outside. And he proved that beeswax is not collected from plants, as people had believed for centuries, but is produced by the bees themselves, secreted from glands on the underside of their abdomens, and then shaped by their mandibles into the hexagonal cells of the comb. His Nouvelles Observations sur les abeilles, published in 1792, stands as one of the landmark texts in the history of entomology. All the more extraordinary for having been produced by a man who never once saw the creatures he studied. The 19th century brought the innovation that would transform beekeeping from an art of destruction into a sustainable practice. For most of history, harvesting honey had meant killing the colony, or at best, causing severe damage to it. There was no way to extract honey without tearing apart the comb, and no way to inspect a hive without effectively demolishing it. This changed in 1851, thanks to a clergyman from Philadelphia named Lorenzo Langstroth. Langstroth noticed something that thousands of beekeepers before him had observed but never thought to measure. Bees maintain a very specific spacing, approximately 9.5 millimeters, between their combs and any adjacent surface. If a gap is smaller than this, bees seal it with propolis, a sticky resin they collect from tree buds. If a gap is larger, they fill it with additional comb. But if the gap is precisely this width, a measurement Langstroth termed bee space, they leave it open as a passageway. It was a deceptively simple observation, but it changed everything. Langstroth designed a hive with removable wooden frames, each separated from its neighbours and from the walls of the hive by exactly the right distance. A beekeeper could now lift out individual frames, inspect them, harvest honey from them, and return them to the hive, all without destroying a single cell of comb or harming the colony. Langstroth patented his design in 1852, and the basic principle remains the standard for beehives used across the world to this day. Other innovations followed in quick succession. In 1857, a German beekeeper named Johannes Mehring invented the comb foundation, preformed sheets of beeswax stamped with a hexagonal pattern, giving bees a head start in building their comb and ensuring that the cells were uniform in size. In 1865, an Austrian military officer named Major Franz von Hruschka invented the honey extractor, a centrifugal device that spins honey out of the comb without destroying it, so that the empty frames can be returned to the hive for the bees to refill. Together, the movable frame hive, the comb foundation, and the honey extractor, these three innovations created the technological basis on which all modern beekeeping rests. The relationship shifted from exploitation to something closer to genuine stewardship. But even as the mechanics of the hive were being mastered, its deepest mystery remained untouched. How did bees talk to each other? How did a forager who had found a field of clover 3 kilometers away communicate that discovery, its direction, its distance, its quality, to her sisters back in the darkness of the hive? The answer, when it finally came, would astonish the world. The language of the dance. In 1919, a young Austrian zoologist named Karl von Frisch was sitting in his garden watching honeybees visit a small dish of sugar water he had set out as bait. He noticed something that seemed at first unremarkable, but nagged at his mind. When a foraging bee discovered the dish and returned to the hive, other bees began appearing at the sugar water within minutes, not wandering randomly, but arriving with a directness that suggested they knew exactly where to go. Von Frisch was intrigued. He began a program of experiments that would occupy the next 5 decades of his life and ultimately reveal one of the most extraordinary communication systems ever discovered in the animal kingdom. His methods were painstaking. He marked individual bees with tiny dots of colored paint so he could track them. He built observation hives with glass walls, allowing him to watch what happened inside the colony when a forager returned from a successful trip. And over years of patient, meticulous observation, he decoded what the bees were doing. They were dancing. When a forager returned to the hive after finding a food source nearby, within about 50 meters, she performed what von Frisch called the round dance. She moved in tight circles on the surface of the comb, alternating direction, while other bees crowded around her, touching her with their antennae, picking up the scent of the flowers she had visited. The message was simple and general. Food is close. Go search the area nearby. But when the food source was farther away, something entirely different happened. The returning forager performed a figure-8 pattern that von Frisch named the waggle dance. During the straight run through the middle of the figure-8, the bee waggled her abdomen vigorously from side to side. And it was in the geometry of this dance that the true astonishment lay. The angle of the straight run, measured against the vertical surface of the comb, indicated the direction of the food source relative to the current position of the sun. A waggle run pointing straight upward meant fly toward the sun. A run angled 30 degrees to the right of vertical meant fly 30 degrees to the right of the sun. The bees were using gravity as a proxy for the sun's position, translating a celestial compass bearing into a dance performed in total darkness on a vertical wax surface. The duration of the waggle phase communicated distance. A longer waggle meant the food was farther away. And the vigour of the dance, how enthusiastically the bee performed it, conveyed the quality of the source. The richer and more abundant the nectar, the more energetic the performance. There was more.
Von Frisch discovered that the bees adjusted the angle of their dance over time to compensate for the movement of the sun across the sky. A dance performed at noon pointed in a slightly different direction from the same dance performed an hour later, because the sun had moved, and the bees accounted for this. They possessed an internal clock synchronized to the sun's arc, and they integrated this information into their communication in real time. And when the sky was overcast, the system did not collapse. Bees can detect the polarization pattern of ultraviolet light that penetrates cloud cover, a pattern invisible to the human eye, and use it to determine the sun's position even when the sun itself is hidden. Their navigation system has a backup that renders it functional in almost any weather. What von Frisch had uncovered was, in essence, an abstract symbolic language. Movement stood for direction. Duration stood for distance. Intensity stood for value. Nothing remotely comparable had ever been documented in any other non-human species. These creatures, with brains containing fewer than 1 million neurons, compared to the 86 billion in a human brain, had evolved a communication system sophisticated enough to transmit precise navigational coordinates in the dark. Von Frisch published his first major account of the dance language in 1927 and spent the following decades refining and expanding his findings. His work was not without controversy. The American biologist Adrian Winner challenged the dance language hypothesis in the 1960s, arguing that bees relied primarily on odor to locate food sources, not on information encoded in the dance. The debate raged for years, but a series of elegant experiments in the early 2000s, including the use of tiny robotic bees that could perform artificial dances, conclusively demonstrated that the dance does indeed convey spatial information,
vindicating von Frisch's original interpretation. In 1973, at the age of 86, von Frisch was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, shared with Konrad Lorenz and Nicholas Tinbergen, for their collective contributions to the science of animal behavior. The Nobel Committee recognized that von Frisch had revealed one of the most extraordinary communication systems in the biological world. The discovery did more than illuminate the inner life of a beehive. It forced a fundamental reassessment of what the word intelligence actually means. If a creature with a brain smaller than a sesame seed could encode, transmit, and decode abstract spatial information using a symbolic language, then the boundary between human cognition and animal cognition was far more porous than anyone had assumed. The Industrial Hive. The 20th century transformed beekeeping from a pastoral tradition practiced in gardens and orchards into an industrial enterprise of breathtaking scale. And the driving force behind this transformation was not honey, it was pollination. As agriculture industrialized over the course of the 20th century, as small, diverse family farms gave way to vast monocultures stretching across thousands upon thousands of acres, a fundamental ecological problem emerged. These enormous single-crop plantations needed pollinators, and they needed them in staggering numbers, concentrated in one place at precisely the right time. But monocultures, by their very nature, are hostile to pollinator populations. A 1,000-acre almond orchard in California's Central Valley bursts into glorious bloom for a few weeks each spring, offering a temporary feast. For the remaining 11 months of the year, it is a nutritional wasteland for any bee trying to make a living there. Wild pollinator communities cannot sustain themselves in such landscapes. They need diversity, a succession of different flowers blooming throughout the season. Monoculture offers the opposite. The answer the agricultural industry arrived at was migratory beekeeping, the practice of loading thousands of hives onto flatbed trucks and driving them across the country to wherever pollination was needed, chasing bloom after bloom, like itinerant workers following the harvest. The scale of this operation, particularly in the United States, is almost difficult to believe. Every February, approximately 1.8 million honeybee colonies, roughly 2/3 of all managed colonies in the entire country, converge on California's Central Valley for the almond bloom. They arrive on thousands of trucks from Florida, from Maine, from North Dakota, from every corner of the nation. For approximately 3 weeks, these bees pollinate around 1.2 million acres of almond trees, a crop whose annual value exceeds $6 billion. When the almond bloom fades, the trucks roll again, north to the apple orchards of Washington State, east to the blueberry fields of Maine, south to the citrus groves of Florida. A single large-scale commercial beekeeper may manage 10,000 hives or more, traveling 10,000 miles in a year. It is one of the great unseen migrations of the modern world, a vast logistical operation that most consumers never think about, even as they eat the food it makes possible. The United States Department of Agriculture estimates that honeybee pollination contributes more than $15 billion annually to the American economy alone.
Globally, the value of pollination services provided by all bees, managed and wild, exceeds $200 billion. The same pattern, on different scales, plays out across the globe. In China, the world's largest beekeeper nation, millions of colonies are transported by truck and even by train to follow the seasonal bloom across the country's vast agricultural regions, from the rapeseed fields of the south to the sunflower plantations of the north. In Australia, migratory beekeepers follow the eucalyptus bloom across thousands of kilometers of bushland. In every major agricultural economy, bees have become mobile infrastructure, biological tools deployed as deliberately as irrigation systems or combine harvesters. But this industrial model, for all its efficiency, carries risks that were not immediately apparent. Concentrating millions of colonies from different regions in close proximity, stressing them with long truck journeys, and exposing them to the monotonous nutrition of a single crop creates conditions that no wild bee population would ever naturally encounter. It is a system optimized for short-term agricultural productivity. Whether it is sustainable in the long term is a question that the early 21st century would answer in the most alarming way possible. The crisis. In the autumn of 2006, a commercial beekeeper named David Hackenberg opened his hives in Florida and found something that made no sense. The hives were not full of dead bees, they were empty. The adult worker bees, tens of thousands of them per colony, had simply vanished. The hives still contained honey, they still contained pollen, they still contained capped brood, baby bees developing in their sealed wax cells, waiting to emerge. But the adults that should have been tending them, feeding them, keeping them warm, were gone. There were no bodies on the ground, no trail of dead bees leading away from the hives. They had disappeared as if they had never existed. Hackenberg reported his losses, and within weeks it became clear that he was not alone. That winter, beekeepers across the United States reported the same bewildering phenomenon. Colony after colony was collapsing. By the end of the season, an estimated 800,000 hives had been lost, roughly a third of all managed colonies in the nation. Scientists gave the phenomenon a clinical name, colony collapse disorder, or CCD. The media gave it a more evocative one. They called it the bee apocalypse. But colony collapse disorder was not, in the end, a single disease with a single cause. It was the visible manifestation of a convergence of pressures that had been building for decades, each one serious on its own and devastating in combination. The first and most destructive of these pressures had a name: Varroa destructor. It is a parasitic mite, originally native to the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana, and it had arrived in the United States in 1987. Asian honeybees had co-evolved with Varroa over millions of years and had developed behavioral defenses against it. They groom each other. They detect and remove infested brood. They have learned to live with the parasite at manageable levels. But the Western honeybee, Apis mellifera, the species that underpins commercial beekeeping worldwide, had no such defenses. It had never encountered this enemy before. Varroa mites are tiny, reddish-brown creatures roughly the size of a pinhead. They attach themselves to bees and feed on their fat body tissue, not on their blood, as was long believed, but on a vital organ analogous to the liver that plays a central role in immunity and nutrition. This discovery, published by the entomologist Samuel Ramsey and his colleagues in 2019, overturned decades of assumption and opened new avenues for understanding how the mite weakens its host. A bee parasitized by Varroa is enfeebled, immunocompromised, and shortened in lifespan. But the mites do something even worse. They serve as vectors, living hypodermic needles for a suite of deadly viruses, including deformed wing virus, acute bee paralysis virus, and others.
A colony heavily infested with varroa can collapse within a year or two, overwhelmed by the combined assault of parasitism and viral disease. The mite spread across the globe with terrifying efficiency, and today there is virtually no corner of the beekeeping world that is free of it. The single notable exception is Australia, which managed to keep varroa out until 2022, when it was detected in the port of Newcastle. A devastating blow that triggered an emergency response and forced Australian beekeepers to confront a threat their counterparts elsewhere had been battling for decades. The second great pressure was chemical. In the 1990s, a new class of insecticides called neonicotinoids was introduced to the market and rapidly became the most widely used insecticides on Earth. Derived from nicotine, these chemicals are systemic, meaning they are taken up by the plant through its roots and distributed throughout every tissue, including the pollen and the nectar. Unlike older contact insecticides that degrade relatively quickly, neonicotinoids persist in the environment, accumulating in soil and leaching into waterways. For bees, the effects are subtle but devastating. Even at doses far too low to kill outright, what toxicologists call sublethal exposure, neonicotinoids disrupt the nervous system. Foragers exposed to these chemicals lose their ability to navigate. They cannot find their way back to the hive. They cannot perform the waggle dance correctly, which means they cannot communicate the location of food sources to their sisters. Memory is impaired. Learning is impaired. The colony does not die in a dramatic, visible event. It bleeds out slowly, losing workers one by one to disorientation and confusion, until there are too few adults left to maintain the brood, regulate temperature, or defend against disease. In 2013, the European Union imposed a partial ban on 3 neonicotinoids, imidacloprid, clothianidin, and thiamethoxam, on crops that attract bees. In 2018, this restriction was expanded to a near-total ban on outdoor use. The United States has moved more slowly, though individual states have adopted their own restrictions, and the Environmental Protection Agency has faced ongoing legal pressure from environmental groups to tighten federal regulations. But the assault on bees does not end with parasites and pesticides. Habitat loss continues to erode the diverse floral landscapes on which bees depend. Where there were once wildflower meadows, hedgerows, and mixed farmland, there are now vast, monotonous expanses of single crops that offer nutrition for a few weeks and nothing for the rest of the year. In the United States alone, an estimated 30 million acres of grassland and prairie were converted to cropland between 2008 and 2016, much of it driven by the expansion of corn and soybean cultivation for ethanol and animal feed. Each acre lost is another piece of habitat that will no longer sustain the wild bees, the butterflies, the hoverflies, and the countless other pollinators that once lived there. Climate change is introducing a new kind of chaos, disrupting the ancient synchrony between the moment flowers bloom and the moment their pollinators emerge from dormancy. A spring that arrives too early or too warm can cause plants to flower before bees are active, leaving both partners stranded, the flowers unpollinated, the bees hungry. In mountain ecosystems, where bumblebees are critical pollinators, rising temperatures are compressing the altitude bands in which these cold-adapted species can survive, pushing them upward towards summits from which there is nowhere further to go. A 2020 study published in the journal Science found that bumblebee populations in North America had declined by nearly 50% since the 1970s, with climate change identified as the primary driver. In 2016, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, published a landmark global assessment warning that a significant proportion of the world's wild bee and butterfly species face declining populations, with some on a trajectory toward extinction. The numbers tell a grim story. In the United States, the number of managed honeybee colonies has fallen from approximately 6 million in the 1940s to roughly 2.7 million today. Beekeepers now routinely lose 30 to 40% of their colonies every winter, a rate of attrition that would have been considered a catastrophe just a few decades ago, but has become the bleak new normal. Among wild bee species, the situation may be even more dire, though comprehensive data is harder to gather for creatures that do not live in managed hives and are not monitored by any industry. It is not hyperbole to describe this as an ecological emergency. The insects that pollinate a third of the food humans eat, that sustain the wildflower meadows and forests that anchor terrestrial ecosystems across the planet, are in serious trouble. The honey problem. There is another crisis in the world of bees that receives far less attention than colony collapse, but is no less corrosive in its own way. It is a crisis not of biology, but of trust. Honey is one of the most adulterated foods on Earth. The economics are straightforward and depressing. Pure honey is expensive to produce. A single honeybee colony yields, on average, between 25 and 30 kilograms of surplus honey per year, though this varies enormously depending on climate, forage quality, and the skill of the beekeeper. Global demand for honey far exceeds what the world's bees can supply at a price most consumers are willing to pay. The gap between supply and demand creates an irresistible incentive for fraud. The most common form of adulteration is simple. Dilute real honey with cheap sugar syrup, typically made from rice, corn, or beet sugar, and sell the mixture as pure honey. The profit margins are enormous. A kilogram of high-fructose rice syrup costs a fraction of what a kilogram of genuine honey commands on the world market. The two look almost identical. They taste similar enough to fool most consumers. And until recently, the fraud was extremely difficult to detect. China, the world's largest honey producer and exporter, has been at the center of this controversy for years. In 2001, the United States imposed anti-dumping tariffs on Chinese honey after investigations revealed that Chinese producers were flooding the American market with honey at below the cost of production. The response from some exporters was not to raise prices, but to launder the honey, shipping it through third countries like India, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia to disguise its origin, a practice known in the trade as transshipment. Simultaneously, ultra-filtered honey, processed to remove all pollen grains, making it impossible to determine the geographical origin of the product, began appearing on supermarket shelves worldwide. In 2013, the United States Department of Justice launched Operation Honeygate, at the time the largest food fraud case in American history. The investigation resulted in criminal charges against executives of several honey import companies, with penalties including millions of dollars in fines and prison sentences. But the problem was not confined to a few bad actors. Testing by Food Safety News and other investigative outlets revealed that a startling percentage of honey sold in American grocery stores contained no pollen at all, a strong indicator that it had been ultra-filtered specifically to conceal adulteration or illegal origin. The problem is global. The European Commission's coordinated testing program has repeatedly found that a significant portion of imported honey fails authenticity tests. In 2023, the results of a major EU-wide screening were published, revealing that nearly half of all imported honey samples tested were suspected of being adulterated. For honest beekeepers around the world, this industrial-scale fraud is devastating. It drives down prices, making it impossible for legitimate producers to compete. It erodes consumer trust in honey as a natural product, and it creates a perverse incentive structure in which the cheapest, most adulterated honey captures the largest market share, while beekeepers who do things properly are punished for their integrity. New analytical techniques, including nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy and stable isotope ratio analysis, are making adulteration harder to hide. But the fraud persists, evolving as fast as the detection methods. It is a reminder that the relationship between humans and bees is not simply a story of ecology and biology. It is also, inescapably, a story of economics and ethics. Fighting back. But this is not a story that ends in darkness, because across the world, on scales both grand and intimate, a counter-movement has been gathering force. In cities from London to Tokyo, from New York to Melbourne, rooftops, balconies, and community gardens are sprouting beehives. Urban beekeeping has grown from a niche hobby into a genuine movement over the past 2 decades. Paris, a city of more than 2 million residents, is now home to over 1,000 rooftop hives, including colonies that have been kept on the roof of the Opéra Garnier since 1982, where bees forage on the chestnut trees and lime blossoms of the city's parks and boulevards, producing honey with a distinctly Parisian terroir. And here is something that surprises many people. Cities can actually be good places for bees. Urban environments contain a far more diverse mix of flowering plants than modern agricultural landscapes. In gardens, parks, cemetery grounds, window boxes, roadside plantings, and neglected lots where wildflowers colonize the cracks. These plants bloom in succession throughout the growing season, providing a steady supply of nectar and pollen. Cities are also largely free from the agricultural pesticides that devastate rural bee populations. And the urban heat island effect, the tendency of cities to be several degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside, extends the flowering season by weeks, giving bees a longer window in which to forage and build their stores. But urban beekeeping, however charming, is only one small piece of a much larger effort, and it carries its own complexities. In some cities, London and Paris among them, the rapid proliferation of managed honeybee hives has raised concerns about competition with wild bees. Honeybees, after all, are generalist foragers that can outcompete native solitary bees and bumblebees for limited urban floral resources. Some conservation biologists now argue that the most helpful thing city dwellers can do for bees is not to keep honeybees, but to plant wildflowers and create nesting habitats for the wild species that are genuinely in trouble. The relationship between conservation and beekeeping is not always as straightforward as it appears. Across Europe and North America, conservationists and governments are working to restore pollinator habitat on a landscape scale. In the United Kingdom, the National Pollinator Strategy, launched in 2014, has promoted the creation of wildflower meadows along motorways, on the margins of farmland, and in public parks and green spaces. The European Union's Common Agricultural Policy now includes provisions requiring farmers to maintain ecological focus areas that benefit pollinators. In the United States, the Conservation Reserve Program pays farmers to take marginal cropland out of production and replant it with native grasses and wildflowers, creating corridors of habitat that connect fragmented landscapes and give bees room to survive. On the scientific front, the fight against Varroa destructor is advancing on multiple fronts. Researchers are breeding honeybees that exhibit heightened hygienic behavior, the ability to detect mite-infested brood cells and remove them before the parasites can reproduce and spread. Programs at institutions like the USDA's Bee Research Laboratory in Baton Rouge and the University of Guelph's Honey Bee Research Center in Canada have made meaningful progress in selecting for these traits. Other researchers are studying wild honeybee populations that have survived for years or decades without any chemical treatment, such as the famous Arno forest population in New York State, studied extensively by the Cornell biologist Thomas Seeley, hoping to identify the genetic and behavioral basis of their natural resistance and breed it into managed stocks. New technologies are being brought to bear as well. Electronic hive monitoring systems can now track a colony's weight, internal temperature, humidity, and even the acoustic signature of the bees in real time, transmitting data to the beekeeper's phone and alerting them to problems. A sudden drop in weight suggesting a swarm has departed. An unusual temperature pattern suggesting the queen may have been lost, days or weeks before a physical inspection would reveal the issue. Artificial intelligence is being trained to analyze the sounds a colony produces, potentially identifying disease, queenlessness, or other stressors from audio recordings alone. Gene editing technologies, particularly CRISPR, are opening possibilities that would have seemed like science fiction a decade ago. Researchers are exploring whether it might be possible to edit the genome of Varroa destructor to reduce its fertility, or to enhance the immune responses of honeybees themselves. These approaches are still in the early research stage and carry significant ethical and ecological questions about releasing genetically modified organisms into the environment. But the potential is immense. The battle against pesticide harm is evolving too. Beyond the European neonicotinoid bans, scientists are developing more targeted approaches to pest control, including RNA interference technologies capable of killing specific pest insects while leaving pollinators completely unharmed. Integrated pest management strategies that minimize chemical inputs and rely instead on biological controls, crop rotation, and habitat management are gaining wider adoption among farmers who have come to understand that poisoning pollinators is, in the long run, poisoning their own livelihood. And perhaps the most powerful force of all is the simplest: awareness. The plight of the bee has become one of the defining environmental narratives of our time. Millions of ordinary people who had never given a moment's thought to pollinators now plant bee-friendly gardens, support local beekeepers, buy pollinator-safe products, and demand accountability from corporations and governments. The bee has become an ambassador, a small, fuzzy, universally recognizable symbol of the intricate web of dependencies that holds the living world together. 130 million years. The story of bees stretches back 130 million years, across mass extinctions, ice ages, continental drift, and the rise and fall of countless ecosystems. They watched the dinosaurs disappear. They survived the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when global temperatures spiked and tropical forests pushed toward the poles. They endured the glaciations of the Pleistocene, retreating and advancing with the ice sheets, always finding a way. They have shaped the world in ways that most people never see. They painted entire landscapes with wildflowers. They sustained the food chains on which terrestrial life depends. They fed human civilizations from the banks of the Nile to the rooftops of Manhattan. They gave us honey and wax, mead and medicine, symbols and metaphors. They gave us almonds, apples, avocados, cherries, coffee, cucumbers, and hundreds of other foods that would vanish from our tables without them. A world without bees would not be a world without one interesting insect. It would be a world in which a third of the crops humans depend on would fail. A world in which wildflower meadows would fade to silence, and the forests that rely on animal pollination would slowly, irreversibly simplify. A world diminished in ways both measurable and immeasurable, less colorful, less fragrant, less abundant, less alive. For 130 million years, the survival of bees was guaranteed by the slow, patient machinery of evolution. That is no longer the case.
For the first time in all those eons, their future depends on choices. Human choices, made in boardrooms and parliaments, in laboratories and on farms, in backyards and on balconies. The colony can endure. It has endured far worse than us, but it needs what it has always needed: flowers to visit, clean air to breathe, a world diverse enough to sustain the ancient contract between the plant and the pollinator. Whether we are wise enough to provide that, whether we can learn to be partners rather than merely takers, is not a question about bees. It is a question about us.